In 1946, following the fall of the Third Reich, the world witnessed a series of executions that marked the closing of one of the darkest chapters in history. Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl, both central figures in the German General Staff, were convicted of crimes against humanity and executed following the Nuremberg Trials. Dostler was the first German general tried and executed by the US military for ordering the illegal execution of Allied prisoners of war in Italy, setting a legal precedent for the treatment of war criminals. Johann Georg Riekert, a commander in Belarus, was convicted and hanged for his atrocities against Soviet civilians and prisoners. Ludwig Kubler was executed by firing squad in 1947 after being found guilty by a Yugoslav military tribunal of war crimes committed during the Nazi occupation of the Balkans. The execution took place outside Ljubljana, in an area used by the Yugoslav authorities to carry out capital sentences against war criminals. Kubler, dressed in his prison uniform, was led under heavy guard to the designated location. Facing the firing squad, he was denied a blindfold, and according to contemporary reports, he maintained a stoic demeanor until the end. Wilhelm Keitel, the fall of the Reich's military architect. On the morning of February 4, 1938, Adolf Hitler restructured the Reich military leadership following the Blomberg-Fritsch crisis. By decree, he created the Oberkommando, Der Wehrmacht, OKW, an organization that would centralize all military operational planning under its direct control. At the head of this new structure, he appointed Wilhelm Keitel, until then a little-known officer outside military circles who held the position of head of the Armed Forces Office. This decision transformed Keitel into the official transmitter of Hitler's military and political directives to the entire Wehrmacht. For the next 7 years, Keitel signed hundreds of operational decrees, secret orders, and military repression directives that formed the administrative backbone of the Nazi criminal system. His office became the indispensable conduit between Hitler's wishes and their practical execution by the German armed forces. His name was printed on documents ordering invasions, extermination campaigns, mass deportations, systematic repression, and mass murder. Far from being a mere intermediary, Keitel tailored each order to operational needs, ensuring that the military machine precisely executed the Führer's will. On June 22, 1941, on the eve of the launch of Operation Barbarossa, Keitel signed one of the most infamous orders of the war, the Kommissar Order, Kommissarbefehl. This document instructed German forces to shoot without trial all captured Soviet political commissars. The directive, considered illegal even by the standards of warfare of the time, was secretly distributed to commanders and systematically executed on the eastern fronts. The order regarded these Soviet officials not as soldiers or prisoners of war, but as ideological incarnations who must be eliminated immediately. During the same campaign, Keitel signed the Barbarossa Decree, which granted complete immunity from prosecution to German soldiers for any crimes committed against the Soviet civilian population. The decree removed all legal restrictions on troops, declaring that excesses committed by German soldiers would not be prosecuted, as they were part of the necessary harshness of the conflict. This provision opened the door to indiscriminate looting, systematic rape, and mass murder of civilians in Belarus, Ukraine, and Western Russia. On December 7, 1941, as world attention was focused on Pearl Harbor, Keitel signed the directive Nacht und Nebel, Night and Fog. This secret order stipulated that those suspected of activities hostile to the Reich in the occupied Western territories were to be arrested without a trace. The victims were secretly deported to German concentration camps, without notification to their families or official registration. Their fate was to remain in night and fog, creating an effect of psychological terror in the occupied populations who saw their citizens disappear without explanation. Another order signed by him, issued on September 16, 1941, authorized disproportionate collective reprisals in all territories under German control. For every German soldier killed by partisans or resistance fighters, between 50 and 100 randomly selected local civilians would be executed. This policy of calculated terrorism was widely applied in Serbia, Greece, France, and Soviet territories. In the Serbian city of Kragujevac, in October 1941, 2,794 civilians were shot in retaliation for the deaths of just 10 German soldiers under direct application of the decree signed by Keitel. In May 1941, another order bearing his signature established the decree on military jurisdiction in the Barbarossa zone of operations, which excluded German soldiers from prosecution for crimes committed against civilians. It also authorized the summary execution of suspected elements, a deliberately ambiguous category that could include anything from peasants to anyone considered remotely hostile. This decree turned the Eastern Front into a lawless space where the Wehrmacht operated with complete impunity. In response to growing resistance in France and the Balkans during 1942, Keitel signed directives instructing occupation units to employ preemptive terror tactics. These included mass arrests, deportations of entire families, and public shootings as deterrents. This repressive approach was particularly severe in Italy after the armistice of September 8, 1943, when German units, with orders approved by Keitel, began punitive operations against the civilian population. Keitel was also instrumental in decisions regarding hostages and executions for sabotage. His office meticulously drafted lists of reprisals that were automatically implemented after any attack on German installations or personnel. In France, these decrees led to the deaths of thousands of civilians between 1943 and 1944, transforming the occupation into a regime of systematic terror. When the Allies liberated the first concentration camps in Western Germany in 1945, they found documentation with forced transfer orders signed by Keitel. These directives required the evacuation of the camps into the interior of the Reich as the front approached, resulting in the devastating death marches. Although many orders came from Himmler and the SS, logistical coordination and military approval bore the stamp of the OKW and Keitel's supervision. During the failed July 20, 1944, plot to assassinate Hitler, Keitel played a central role in the ensuing repression. He signed arrest warrants for numerous officers and personally directed the reorganization of the command structure following the purge. He strongly supported the immediate execution of high-ranking officers without trial, as was the case with Generals Friedrich Olbricht and Ludwig Beck. On the 8th of May 1945, following Germany's unconditional surrender, Keitel signed the Surrender Act in Berlin on behalf of the Wehrmacht. 5 days later, he was captured by American troops and sent to Nuremberg. On 6 October 1945, he was formally notified that he would be one of the prime defendants before the International Military Tribunal, facing 4 charges: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. During the trial, the prosecution presented dozens of documents bearing his signature, demonstrating his direct involvement in the regime's criminal machinery. Keitel did not deny having signed the orders, but based his defense on the principle of due obedience, arguing that as a professional soldier, he was obliged to comply with the Führer's decisions. On October 1, 1946, after being found guilty on all 4 charges, Wilhelm Keitel was sentenced to death by hanging. In a final act of resistance, he requested to be shot as befitted an officer, but his request was denied. He was executed on October 16 at 1 a.m. in Nuremberg prison. His body was cremated and his ashes scattered in an unmarked stream to prevent his grave from becoming a site of pilgrimage. With Keitel's death, one of the clearest symbols of the German military's subordination to the criminal designs of Nazism disappeared. His name became associated not only with the military defeat of the Reich, but also with the use of the armed forces as a direct instrument of genocide, repression, and mass murder. Alfred Jodl, the doomed strategist. Between September 1939 and May 1945, Colonel General Alfred Jodl served as chief of the OKW operations staff, becoming the strategic mind behind all of the Third Reich's military campaigns. A direct subordinate of Wilhelm Keitel and Hitler's confidant, Jodl was responsible for translating the Führer's war ambitions into concrete operational guidelines. His daily task was to transform strategic concepts into executable orders that would then be implemented by field commanders. In this process, Jodl not only defined the military structure of German invasions, but also facilitated the implementation of repressive and criminal policies across Europe. From the first days of the war, Jodl's office produced circulars authorizing the use of disproportionate force against civilian populations. During the invasion of Poland in September 1939, he issued directives allowing field commanders to hand over any suspected resistance fighters to the Gestapo for elimination or internment, in blatant violation of international conventions on military occupation and the treatment of prisoners. What was officially called internal military security was, in practice, a system of terror administered by the regular army. During the Norwegian campaigns, April 1940, and later during the invasion of France and the Netherlands, Jodl coordinated with Keitel the implementation of repressive policies against the local populations. In the Netherlands, his signature appeared on orders authorizing preventive arrests and deportations of civilians considered dangerous or demoralizing to the German war effort. These measures, implemented without judicial oversight, transformed the occupation into a regime of calculated terror. One of the most incriminating documents bearing his signature is the Commissar's Order, Kommissarbefehl, drawn up in preparation for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. This order instructed German soldiers to shoot without trial all captured Soviet political commissars, considered ideological enemies of the Reich. The directive was distributed as a secret document, with specific instructions that its contents should not reach lower-ranking commanders in writing, evidencing an awareness of its illegality and an attempt to evade future responsibility. That same year, Jodl participated in the writing of the infamous Nacht- und Nebel-Erlass, Night and Fog Decree, which provided for the enforced disappearance of civilians suspected of resistance activities in Western Europe. These people were secretly arrested, deported to concentration camps in Germany, and deliberately erased from the administrative system. Their families were given no information about their whereabouts or fate. The directive explained that these disappearances were to have a paralyzing effect on the civilian population, revealing their purpose of mass psychological terror. In October 1942, Jodl signed the so-called Commando Order, Kommandobefehl, which stipulated the summary execution of all captured Allied commandos, whether they were in uniform or had formally surrendered. This order, which blatantly violated the Geneva Convention, was particularly enforced in France and Norway, where British units and members of the SAS were executed after surrendering in special operations. The directive removed any legal protection for enemy special forces, denying them prisoner of war status. In 1944, Jodl signed the orders for the total evacuation of northern Norway in the face of the Soviet advance. This operation involved the systematic destruction of entire villages, the massive burning of homes, and the forced deportation of some 50,000 Norwegian civilians as part of a scorched earth policy. The order, issued by the OKW, coldly specified that not a single roof of useful land should be left for the enemy, condemning the local population to extreme conditions in the Arctic winter. At the end of the war, Jodl was arrested by American troops and sent to Nuremberg. At his trial before the International Military Tribunal, he faced the same 4 charges as the top Nazi leaders: crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and conspiracy to commit these acts. His position as a military strategist placed him at the very center of the planning of aggressive wars and criminal policies. During his testimony, Jodl developed a sophisticated but fundamentally flawed defense. He argued that he acted solely as a military planning officer, with no authority over political or occupation decisions. He maintained that his role was merely technical and executive, merely conveying decisions made at higher levels. He claimed to abide by the oath of military obedience, with no intention of participating in criminal acts. This artificial separation between the military and political dimensions of the war was systematically dismantled by the prosecution. Prosecutors presented dozens of documents bearing his signature that contradicted his story. Evidence showed that he not only issued orders but also actively participated in drafting them and in meetings where the use of illegal methods of warfare was openly discussed. His defense crumbled when it was established that he had explicit knowledge of the criminal nature of many military directives and that he had consciously contributed to their formulation. During the hearings, obvious contradictions emerged between the statements of Jodl and Keitel. Both attempted to downplay their decision-making power, but at various points they contradicted each other, revealing inconsistencies in their testimony. Jodl attempted to distance himself from the collective reprisals, while Keitel identified him as the direct author of some internal security measures in occupied areas. One of the most talked-about episodes of the trial was the written intervention of Alfred Jodl's wife, Louise, who asked the court to review her husband's role in the general staff. She offered documentation to argue its purely technical and operational nature, in a desperate attempt to save him from the maximum sentence. After his execution, Louise Jodl continued to actively campaign for her husband's posthumous rehabilitation, convinced of the unfairness of the sentence. On October 16, 1946, Alfred Jodl was executed at Nuremberg prison along with 10 other convicts. He was hanged at approximately 1:15 a.m. According to eyewitnesses, his last words were, "Ich greeting say, my wife's Deutschland. I greet you, my eternal Germany," a final nationalist gesture that reflected his conviction in the German cause despite everything. His body was cremated alongside those of Keitel, Ribbentrop, and other high-ranking Nazi officials, and his ashes scattered in a tributary of the Isar to prevent the creation of memorial sites. Anton Dostler, the bloody precedent. In the early morning of March 22, 1944, 15 American soldiers from the 2,677th Special Regiment of the OSS, Office of Strategic Services, landed stealthily on the coast of Ameglia, near La Spezia in northern Italy. Their mission, codenamed Operation Guinea 2, was to blow up a strategic rail tunnel used by the Wehrmacht to supply the Gustav Line, the German defensive system blocking the Allied advance into northern Italy. Armed, uniformed, and with full military identification, these men represented the vanguard of Allied special operations in occupied territory. 4 days later, on March 26th, the 15 men were lined up in front of a hastily dug trench on the outskirts of a small Italian village. Without trial, without formal process, without opportunity for defense, they were machine-gunned to death by a German firing squad. The order that sealed their fate bore the signature of Infantry General Anton Dostler, commander of the German 75th Army Corps in the northern Italian sector. This execution blatantly violated the 1929 Geneva Convention, which clearly stated that all soldiers captured in uniform who had not committed illegal acts of war were to be treated as prisoners of war. The Americans met all the requirements. They wore regular uniforms, carried official military identification, and operated under direct orders from the Allied High Command. The case sparked immediate outrage among the Allied forces, who meticulously documented it for future legal action. Dostler was captured near Lake Garda in June 1945, a few weeks after the German surrender. He was transferred to the military prison in Aversa and placed at the disposal of the Allied military tribunal in Italy, which was based in the historic royal palace of Caserta. The trial took place between October 8 and 12, 1945, and was one of the first war crimes trials conducted by the Allied powers after the conflict. This case would mark a turning point in the legal interpretation of the criminal liability of senior officers in the German military, establishing legal precedents that would lay the groundwork for the subsequent Nuremberg Trials. Dostler's defense attorney based his strategy on the due obedience argument, arguing that his client had merely followed orders from the German Supreme Command, specifically the so-called Commando Order, Kommandobefehl, issued by Hitler on October 18, 1942. This directive ordered the summary execution of all captured enemy commandos, regardless of their uniform or surrender status. The prosecution, however, presented compelling evidence that Dostler had personally approved the execution, even after one of his subordinates, Colonel Almers, expressed legal doubts about the order. This crucial fact demonstrated that Dostler was aware of the potential illegality of the action but decided to proceed anyway. Even more revealing was the case of Lieutenant Colonel Alexander zu Dohna-Schlobitten, Dostler's deputy officer, who explicitly refused to sign the execution order, considering it a violation of international law. This refusal cost him his job, and he was immediately dismissed by Dostler. These elements demonstrated what would become a fundamental principle in subsequent war crimes trials. Dostler had a real right to refuse to comply with the order, and other officers under his command had exercised that right, paying a professional price but demonstrating that resistance was possible. The tribunal concluded that the order was manifestly unlawful and that an officer of his rank and experience should have recognized its criminal nature. During the hearings, testimony was presented by German soldiers who had participated in the arrest, confirming that the Americans offered no resistance after their capture, were fully uniformed, and carried standard military identification. Furthermore, internal OKW reports were presented demonstrating that there was no operational urgency justifying the expeditious execution, dismissing any argument of military necessity. The court found Dostler guilty on the 12th of October 1945. He was sentenced to death by firing squad, a method of execution considered more honorable than hanging reserved for common criminals. The execution was scheduled for 1 December 1945 at the Aversa military camp near Naples, and the order was signed by American General Joseph T. McNarney, the Allied Commander-in-Chief in Italy. Dostler's execution has a historic distinction. It was meticulously documented. The U.S. Army Signal Corps filmed the entire process and took detailed photographs that were later used for educational purposes. The footage shows the general being led to the execution site at dawn, tied to a wooden post, blindfolded, and finally shot by an American firing squad. His body fell instantly, marking the first official execution of a German general for violations of the laws of war under Allied authority. These recordings had a very specific purpose. They were used in Allied military legal training and in briefings prior to the start of the Nuremberg Trials, as a practical demonstration of the new era of criminal accountability that was dawning for Axis officers. The message was unequivocal. Rank would not protect those who had ordered or carried out war crimes. Dostler's judgment was carefully studied during the drafting of the Nuremberg Principles, especially Principle 4, which establishes that compliance with superior orders does not exempt from criminal liability if there was a moral or practical choice. This principle has endured as a cornerstone of modern international criminal law. The jurisprudence developed in the Dostler case established that the military hierarchy cannot be invoked as a shield for manifestly criminal acts. The ruling considered that even under totalitarian systems, superior officers retain moral and legal agency, and that the duty to disobey clearly illegal orders prevails over military subordination. The trial and execution were widely covered in the international press. The New York Times published an editorial titled "No More Excuses" the day after the execution, applauding the decision to uncompromisingly apply international law and describing the trial as an exemplary act of justice. In occupied Germany, the news was broadcast as a direct warning to officers who were still attempting to evade responsibility by claiming to be following orders. Johann Georg Riekert, the partisan executioner. In July 1942, as the Wehrmacht concentrated its forces for the offensive towards the Caucasus and Stalingrad, General Johann Georg Riekert assumed command of the 286th Security Division, 286th Sicherungsdivision, on the central sector of the Eastern Front. This unit, unlike the combat divisions, was not intended to directly confront Soviet regular forces. Its mission was much more grim, to ensure absolute control of the conquered territories in the rear of Army Group Center, specifically in the heart of occupied Belarus. Riekert's duties included securing railway lines, suppressing any resistance activity, protecting resource extraction, and carrying out anti-partisan operations. In practice, these duties resulted in a systematic campaign of terror, repression, and annihilation against the Belarusian civilian population deemed hostile or suspected of collaborating with the resistance. For 2 years, between 1942 and 1944, Riekert personally directed dozens of operations euphemistically referred to as Bandenbekämpfung, fighting bandits, a term that obscured their true nature: extermination campaigns that razed hundreds of villages, mass executions of civilians, and forced deportations to labor camps. Instructions came directly from his office in the form of signed orders specifying preemptive measures against any village that showed the slightest hint of partisan sympathy, even if there was no concrete evidence of active collaboration. Wehrmacht operational reports recovered by Soviet forces after the liberation of Belarus offer shocking figures. Under Riekert command, the 286th Division reported having eliminated more than 23,000 people in just 6 months during 1943. These macabre statistics were presented in war reports as anti-partisan successes, although internal OKW and SS documents acknowledged that less than 10% of the victims had any proven connection to resistance groups. The vast majority were simple peasants, teachers, doctors, or local officials whose only crime had been to live in areas considered strategic. One of the most brutal episodes under his command occurred in the summer of 1943 in the Lepel and Ushachi regions in the heart of Belarus. Riekert's units executed a scorched earth policy with mechanical precision. They surrounded villages at dawn, forced the inhabitants to abandon their homes, methodically separated men, women, and children, and proceeded to systematically shoot the adult males. The houses were then burned, and the survivors, mainly women, the elderly, and children, were deported to labor camps or simply abandoned without shelter in the heart of war-ravaged territory. Operational reports of these actions included the destruction of suspicious elements as objectives accomplished, a euphemism masking the deliberate elimination of defenseless civilians. Another documented operation under his authority took place between March 12 and 16, 1944, when Riekert authorized the forced deportation of over 40,000 civilians to the makeshift Ozorichi camps, located in a swampy area in southern Belarus. This action, coordinated with SS units and Einsatzkommando 7B, created an open-air concentration camp without basic infrastructure. The deportees, mainly the elderly, women and children, were abandoned in swampy terrain without adequate shelter, food or medical care. Documents signed by Riekert revealed the explicit intention to isolate and eliminate unfit elements, considered a useless burden on the war economy. In less than 2 weeks, more than 9,000 people died from dysentery, extreme cold, or simple exhaustion. The Soviet advance during Operation Bagration in June 1944 led to the complete collapse of the German lines in Belarus. Riekert hastily retreated with the remnants of his division westward, but was finally captured by the Red Army on May 8, 1945, during the surrender of the last German formations on the Eastern Front. He was immediately transferred to Minsk, capital of the Belarusian Soviet Republic, where he was taken into NKVD custody awaiting trial. In January 1946, the Soviet government organized one of the largest public trials ever held against German war criminals in Minsk, with Riekert as the central figure. In total, 19 officers and non-commissioned officers of the Wehrmacht, the SD, and the Reich Police were prosecuted for crimes against the Belarusian civilian population. The trial was widely documented by Soviet newsreels and international press correspondence, becoming a public spectacle with great propaganda and legal value. The trial began on January 15, 1946, presided over by a Soviet military tribunal with special jurisdiction over war crimes. The charges against Riekert were specific and devastating: systematic extermination of civilians, destruction of 459 Belarusian villages, illegal deportation of the population, torture and murder of Soviet prisoners of war, and direct participation in the creation and administration of the Ozorichi extermination camps. During the hearings, the prosecution presented original documents signed by Riekert, along with harrowing testimony from more than 200 Belarusian survivors. Among the most shocking was that of Maria Buzina, then a 12-year-old girl, who recounted in detail how her mother and 2 brothers were shot before her eyes after refusing to leave their home in a village in the Vitebsk region. Another key witness, Ivan Romanovich, a rural teacher, described how units under Riekert's command executed 83 inhabitants of his village on the unfounded accusation of having hidden a wounded partisan. Interrogations revealed that Riekert not only approved the operations but had personally established the collective punishment zone criterion, according to which the prior presence of guerrillas within a 5-kilometer radius was sufficient to order the total elimination of a settlement. This principle, applied systematically, turned vast regions of Belarus into zones of arbitrary death. On January 28, 1946, after 2 weeks of proceedings, the tribunal issued its verdict. Johann Georg Riekert was sentenced to death for crimes against humanity and systematic violations of the laws of war. The verdict established that the methodical, planned, and massive nature of the crimes placed him in the category of direct responsibility, regardless of his position in the military hierarchy. The execution was scheduled for January 30th, 1946, 2 days after the verdict. Unlike Western trials, which tended to carry out executions in the privacy of prisons, the Soviet authorities organized a public spectacle of mass execution in the heart of Minsk. Freedom Square was equipped to accommodate a huge crowd. It is estimated that more than 100,000 people gathered to witness the end of those they held directly responsible for the suffering of Belarus, the Soviet territory proportionally most devastated by the Nazi occupation. The condemned prisoners were transported in open trucks from the prison to the square, exposed to public view and then hanged from wooden scaffolding erected in front of the Central Committee building of the Belarusian Communist Party. Gottfried von Erdmannsdorff, the General of Riga. During the German occupation of the Baltic, while the bulk of the Axis forces fought on the main fronts, security military units carried out operations that far exceeded the limits of conventional warfare. Among the officers involved in this parallel war of extermination and territorial control was General Gottfried von Erdmannsdorff, played a central role in implementing repressive policies in Latvia and neighboring regions of Belarus. His actions as a military commander, his subsequent capture and his public execution in Riga in 1946 represent one of the first formal examples of accountability for atrocities committed in the Baltic territories during the war. Erdmannsdorff was initially assigned as commander of the Mogilev fortified area and subsequently assumed responsibility for strategic sectors of eastern Latvia during the years 1942 to 1944. From this position, he directly controlled units of the Heer, regular army, was supported by elements of the SD, security service, and closely collaborated with the civilian administration of the Reichskommissariat, Ostland, the civil administrative structure created for the occupied Baltic territories. During his command in this region, Erdmannsdorff systematically implemented anti-partisan cleansing policies that in practice resulted in the complete destruction of at least 140 villages and the documented murder of more than 17,000 civilians, according to Soviet records and German archives captured after the war. The basic strategy was to apply collective punishment measures against any population suspected of providing support, even indirect, to Soviet partisan units operating in the region. Typical operations under his authority included the systematic burning of entire villages, the immediate execution of all males over the age of 15, and the forcible deportation of women, children, and the elderly to transit camps or forced labor facilities in Riga or Kaunas. Reports from the German 16th Army, approved and personally signed by Erdmannsdorff, contain explicit references to the removal of unusable elements during the construction of defensive fortifications, a transparent euphemism for the summary execution of civilians who were incapable of performing forced labor. In September 1943, during a counterinsurgency operation in the Vitebsk forests, units under his command surrounded 5 villages and systematically executed all the inhabitants, including 234 individually documented children. The troops also burned schools, community centers, and agricultural warehouses, completely devastating the civilian infrastructure. The operational orders, later recovered, included written instructions to avoid excessive ammunition consumption during mass executions, recommending the use of hand grenades in buildings where groups of civilians were sheltering. Erdmannsdorff also directed the implementation of mass deportations in Latvia as part of the so-called filtration of hostile populations. In the Krustpils district, approximately 8,000 people were forcibly displaced by direct order of the military command without prior selection or classification. According to later statements by subordinate officers, the trains used for these deportations lacked basic provisions and were simultaneously used to transport ammunition and military equipment, resulting in inhumane conditions that resulted in numerous deaths during the journey. During the construction of defensive fortifications in the Daugavpils region, Erdmannsdorff established temporary labor camps where civilians deemed inefficient or physically unfit were summarily executed at the end of each day's work. The executions were carried out using standardized methods, and the bodies were buried in mass graves in nearby forests in operations coordinated with specialized units of the Sicherheitsdienst, the SS intelligence service. On January 23, 1946, the Soviet military trial of Erdmannsdorff and 13 other German officers captured after the fall of the Reich began in Riga. The proceedings were organized as an extraordinary Red Army tribunal with prosecutors from the NKVD and official representation from the Soviet Latvian government. Erdmannsdorff faced extremely serious formal charges, implementation of policies of civilian extermination under military pretexts, systematic destruction of educational and religious infrastructure, execution of Soviet prisoners of war, organization of mass deportations without legal justification, and direct participation in massacres of vulnerable civilians in areas declared red or areas of partisan activity. The trial was held in public at the Riga State Theatre, with over 700 people in attendance daily, including victims' families, Communist Party members, and representatives of Latvian partisan units that had fought against the German occupation. The prosecution presented extensive and methodologically organized documentation, including original war reports, logistical reports, and operational orders personally signed by Erdmannsdorff, which specified the treatment of civilians as hostile elements and explicitly authorized mass executions. Witnesses presented during the trial included survivors from at least 3 villages destroyed by units under his command. One woman, Eva Kalnina, recounted in detail how she was forced to witness the execution of her husband and 8-year-old daughter after refusing to reveal information about a partisan group whose location she did not know. Another crucial witness, farmer Arvids Eglitis, claimed to have witnessed German troops locking 53 people, mainly elderly people and children, in a barn, which they then set on fire after throwing grenades inside. Erdmannsdorff's direct collaboration with Einsatzkommando 1A, a special unit responsible for the mass murder of Jews and Soviet political commissars in the Baltic region. Although he did not formally belong to the SS, it was proven that he provided logistical resources, transportation, and forced civilian labor for the extermination operations, establishing fluid cooperation between regular military structures and the extermination units. The verdict was delivered on January 25, 1946. Erdmannsdorff was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to death by hanging. The execution, planned with military precision, was held in public and took place on January 26, 1946 in Riga's Freedom Square, the most important symbolic space in the Latvian capital. The 14 condemned officers were transported to the site in open trucks and led onto specially erected wooden scaffolding in front of the Freedom Monument, the Latvian national symbol. Approximately 30,000 people gathered to witness the act, according to contemporary Soviet reports. The execution was carried out by specialized NKVD personnel and lasted approximately 2 hours. Following Soviet practice in such cases, the bodies remained on display until the afternoon as a public demonstration of justice, before being unceremoniously removed and buried in unmarked mass graves on the outskirts of Riga. The massive presence of local citizens was no coincidence. The Soviet authorities meticulously organized the event as an act of political pedagogy and exemplary justice. Printed bulletins containing the names of the victims and partial transcripts of the trial were distributed and publicly read in factories, schools, and military units. Many attendees were immediate family members of those murdered during the occupation who were allowed to witness the executions from specially designated areas. The event was partially filmed by Soviet cameramen, and the resulting footage was incorporated into state documentaries and newsreels that were broadcast for decades as part of the official narrative of Soviet liberation. The mass execution was described by the official press as the final closure of an era of horror, presenting the execution as an act of historical justice rather than simply an individual punishment. Eberhard Herf, Reprisals and Mass Executions. Between 1941 and 1944, while world attention was focused on major troop movements and decisive battles, Eberhard Herf wielded near absolute power as commander of the Ordnungspolizei, Order Police, in Minsk, a structure integrated into the complex German occupation apparatus in Belarus. Under his direct authority, German police forces implemented systematic campaigns of repression, deportation, and extermination, operating in close coordination with the SS and Einsatzgruppen to destroy any form of resistance and eliminate populations deemed hostile, particularly Jews, communists, and civilians suspected of collaborating with the partisan resistance. Herf directed included regular military police battalions, auxiliary units formed by local collaborators, Schutzmannschaften, and special detachments attached to the Sicherheitsdienst, the SS security service. These forces implemented extermination methods consisting mainly of mass shootings in forests, ditches, or open fields, as well as organized deportations to concentration camps such as Mali Trostenetz, established on the outskirts of Minsk specifically for extermination operations. One of the methods systematically employed under his direction was the execution of hostages after every action of the partisan resistance. For every attack against German personnel or facilities, meticulously drawn-up lists were issued of civilians to be publicly shot or taken to execution sites in wooded areas. The Blagovщина forest, for example, became one of the main sites of mass shootings. Documents recovered by the Soviet NKVD and post-war forensic records indicate that more than 80,000 people were executed at that site between 1941 and 1943. Many under the direct supervision or express authorization of the Herf Police Command. In addition to the executions, Herf's command operationally coordinated the liquidation of the Minsk Ghetto, an operation formally initiated in 1942 that involved the deportation and systematic murder of the city's Jewish population. During the so-called actions of August and November, thousands of Jews were transported by train and truck to the Mali camp, Trostenetz, where they were murdered by gunfire or in modified gas vans. Herf was directly responsible for managing the transfers and assigning police personnel to surround the ghetto, monitor operations, and coordinate the transportation of victims. The Third Reich, Herf was captured by Soviet troops and taken to Minsk, where he stood trial along with Johann Georg Riekert and 16 other German officers accused of similar crimes. The trial began on January 15, 1946, in the Red Army House of Culture, a public building with a capacity to hold hundreds of spectators. The Soviet military tribunal formally charged Herf with crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, with particular emphasis on his role in the mass executions of civilians, his participation in the extermination of the Jewish population, and his responsibility for forced deportations. As in the Riekert case, the trial was public and attended by thousands of Soviet citizens, many of them survivors or relatives of victims of the atrocities. The prosecution presented abundant documentation and detailed testimony illustrating the workings of the repressive structures under Herf's direct command. Among the most incriminating evidence were police reports signed by him personally, in which he ordered the expeditious liquidation of detainees without any judicial process. In the city of Slutsk, police units subordinate to Herf carried out one of the most documented massacres of the entire Belarusian campaign. In October 1941, during an operation euphemistically described as a security action, more than 3,600 people were executed in just 2 days, mainly Jews and people suspected of links to partisan groups. Operational orders, according to later testimony from junior officers, emanated directly from Herf through the regional chain of command. In the village of Baranovichi during the harsh winter of 1942, Ordnungspolizei patrols participated in operations involving the systematic burning of entire villages and the indiscriminate execution of their inhabitants. One case particularly documented during the trial was that of the village of Horodische, where 122 people, including 76 women and children, were executed after the discovery of a food cache that the German authorities attributed to the partisans. Herf, according to Soviet documentation presented at the trial, personally visited the site 2 days after the massacre and congratulated the officers responsible for their deterrent efficiency, subsequently promoting several of them. During the trial, Soviet prosecutors read excerpts from German police reports recovered in Minsk after the city's liberation. These documents included detailed descriptions of pacification operations that actually consisted of mass killings of civilians, as well as official correspondence between Herf and the SD coordinating joint actions to eliminate pockets of cultural and ethnic resistance, a transparent euphemism for the extermination of specific groups. A key witness, Anatoly Grishin, a survivor from the village of Smilovici, testified in court that in March 1943 he witnessed police units under Herf's command methodically shooting women and children after setting fire to their homes. He added that he personally saw Herf supervising one of these operations from a vehicle under official escort. demonstrating his direct presence at the scene of the crimes. During the trial, Herf did not deny having signed the incriminating orders, but built his defense around the argument that he was obeying higher orders from the High Command of the Reichskommissariat. Ostland. He attempted to characterize his actions as legitimate security measures within an active war zone and described the victims as insurgent elements or accomplices of saboteurs. The Soviet tribunal categorically rejected this line of defense, finding the evidence clearly demonstrated the criminal nature of the orders and his conscious responsibility for their implementation. On January 30th, 1946, after a 2-week trial, Eberhard Herf was publicly executed along with Johann Georg Riekert and 12 other condemned officers. The executions took place in Minsk's main square before an estimated crowd of 100,000 people, many of whom had lost relatives during the German occupation. The condemned men were transported in open trucks from the prison to the square, handcuffed and escorted by special units of the Soviet NKVD. Each was hanged on a wooden scaffold built specifically for the occasion. Following Soviet practice for these public executions, the bodies remained exposed for several hours as part of the public ritual of justice and as a tangible demonstration of the end of Nazi rule in the region. The executions were meticulously documented by Soviet film crews and later used in newsreels and historical documentaries for both informational and propaganda purposes. Helmuth von Pannwitz, a Cossack general. Known but legally most complex episodes of World War II is the collaboration of Cossack units with the German armed forces and their tragic fate after the surrender of the Reich. At the center of this story is General Helmuth von Pannwitz, a Wehrmacht cavalry officer and commander of the 15 Cossack Cavalry Corps, a military formation made up of tens of thousands of Soviet Cossack exiles or prisoners who fought on the German side against the Soviet Union. His capture, trial, and execution by the Soviet authorities constitute a particularly controversial chapter in the history of post-war reprisals. Beginning in 1942, the German High Command, OKW, authorized the creation of military units composed of Cossacks captured during the invasion or exiled after the Bolshevik Revolution. In 1943, Pannwitz was given command of the 1st Cossack Cavalry Division, initially formed in the occupied Kuban, a region of traditional Cossack presence in southern Russia. This unit grew rapidly, incorporating contingents made up of descendants of white Cossacks who had found refuge in Yugoslavia, Germany, and Poland after the Russian Civil War, and who saw the German invasion as an opportunity to recover their ancestral lands. In 1944, this division was expanded to become the 15th Cossack Cavalry Corps, a formation operating under the operational control of the Wehrmacht but maintaining close ties with the SS, especially towards the end of the conflict. Its primary mission was to conduct anti-partisan operations in Ukraine, Belarus, and later the Balkans, as well as to contain the advance of the Red Army in southeastern Europe. Military reports from the OKH Army High Command revealed that Pannwitz units were actively involved in reprisal operations against civilian populations in Croatia, Slovenia, and Bosnia, regions where they were deployed during the final phase of the war. Documents preserved in archives in Belgrade and Moscow report numerous incidents of mass killings of suspected partisans, systematic looting of villages, and deliberate destruction of crops, attributed directly to the Cossack brigades under his command. These units quickly acquired a fearsome reputation among the civilian population for the brutality of their methods and the iron discipline imposed by Pannwitz, who combined traditional Prussian cavalry techniques with the tactical autonomy typical of Cossack formations. In May 1945, as the Third Reich finally collapsed, the Cossack Corps under Pannwitz's command voluntarily surrendered to British forces in Austria, specifically in the Lienz region. As a German officer, Pannwitz expected to receive the standard treatment reserved for Western prisoners of war. However, the situation was dramatically complicated by the agreements reached at the Yalta Conference between Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, which stipulated the mandatory repatriation of all Soviet citizens and Axis collaborators, regardless of their current nationality or personal circumstances. The so-called Operation Keelhaul organized by the British Army between May and June 1945, consisted of the forced surrender of more than 50,000 Cossacks and their families to the Soviet authorities. This operation was carried out despite the fact that many of them were not technically Soviet citizens, having been born in exile or having left Russia before the formal establishment of the USSR. The operation was carried out ruthlessly, despite protests from some British officers present on the ground, and multiple mass suicides among the Cossacks who preferred death to forced repatriation to the Soviet Union, where execution or the Gulag almost certainly awaited them. Pannwitz, being a German and not a Soviet citizen, was not initially included on the mandatory repatriation lists. The British military authorities offered him the option of remaining in Austria and seeking asylum as a POW officer, thus separating himself from the fate of his subordinates. According to documented testimony from British officers and Cossack survivors, Pannwitz flatly rejected this offer and demanded to be handed over along with his men, declaring, "I fought alongside them. It would be dishonorable to abandon them now." This gesture was interpreted by many members of the Cossack community as an extraordinary demonstration of loyalty and military honor, elevating Pannwitz to the status of a heroic figure among his troops. British Foreign Office documents, declassified decades later in the 1980s, confirmed that this decision was formally communicated to the local British command and that Pannwitz voluntarily signed his repatriation request despite being fully aware of the likely consequences of this choice. Once in Soviet territory, Pannwitz was immediately transferred to Moscow, where he was held in the notorious Lefortovo prison, one of the most feared detention centers of the Soviet security apparatus. There, he met the main Cossack military leaders who had collaborated with Germany, including Pyotr Krasnov, former Tsarist general and writer, Andrei Shkuro, Cossack commander of the Civil War, Timofey Domonov, hetman of the Don Cossacks, and Sultan Kelek Gire, leader of the Caucasian units. All of them were subjected to a secret trial conducted by the Military Tribunal of the Supreme Collegium of the USSR, a body specializing in highly sensitive political proceedings. The proceedings took place behind closed doors between January 15th and 16th, 1947, without international observers or foreign press, following standard Stalinist judicial protocols for cases deemed to involve national security. The charges against Pannwitz were extremely serious: high treason against the Soviet people, active collaboration with the Nazi invaders, command of units responsible for the mass murder of Soviet civilians, and military sabotage behind the Red Army. Although Pannwitz was not a Soviet citizen and therefore technically could not have committed treason against the USSR, the court argued that his role as commander of the Cossack Corps in operations against Soviet citizens justified the application of the infamous Article 58-1 of the Soviet Criminal Code pertaining to counter-revolutionary activities and treason. The Soviet prosecution presented as evidence detailed operational records of the 15th Cossack Corps, testimony from captured and later released Soviet prisoners, and military documentation found in Austria during the surrender. Execution lists from Yugoslavia, Croatia, and Ukraine bearing the signatures of officers directly subordinate to Pannwitz were introduced as evidence. Although he was not charged with personal participation in the executions, his command responsibility for crimes perpetrated by troops under his direct authority was established. The Soviet Military Tribunal sentenced him to death by hanging on January 16, 1947. The verdict, signed by General Vasily Ulrich, president of the Military Tribunal of the Supreme Collegium and a prominent figure in the Stalinist trials, established that the accused Helmuth von Pannwitz, in his capacity as commander of forces hostile to the Soviet people, consciously and systematically contributed to the organization and execution of war crimes and acts of treason, for which reason he must be punished to the fullest extent of Soviet law. Along with Pannwitz, 11 other Cossack commanders were convicted and executed, most of them Russian citizens who had left the USSR after the Bolshevik Revolution. The sentence was carried out immediately, without any possibility of appeal or judicial review, following standard Soviet judicial practice in political cases of this nature. The execution was carried out on the same day as the sentencing in Lefortovo prison by hanging, the standard procedure in the USSR for convictions for treason or collaboration with the enemy. Pannwitz's body, like that of the others executed, was buried in unmarked mass graves on the grounds of the Donskoy Cemetery in Moscow, the usual burial site for political prisoners during the Stalinist era. The case was not reported by the official Soviet press and remained classified for more than 4 decades. Only after the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the partial opening of previously inaccessible archives did the precise details of the trial and execution become known through documents declassified by the FSB, the successor to the Soviet KGB. In 1996, during Boris Yeltsin's presidency, and in the context of a critical review of Stalinist repression, Pannwitz's family formally requested his posthumous rehabilitation from the Russian authorities. The Moscow Military Prosecutor's Office initially approved the request, arguing that the original proceedings lacked basic legal guarantees and that the defendant, not being a Soviet citizen, could not be tried for treason against a state to which he had never belonged. However, this decision sparked intense controversy in Russia, especially among war veterans and patriotic organizations. In 2001, the Supreme Military Court of the Russian Federation overturned the preliminary rehabilitation, concluding that Pannwitz had been legally convicted as a commander of foreign forces responsible for documented war crimes and that his execution was in accordance with the legislation in force at the time of the events, regardless of his nationality. Ludwig Kubler, the sacrificed Marshal of the Alps. In the final years of World War II, the Julian Alps and northern Italy became one of the bloodiest arenas of confrontation between the partisan resistance and the Axis occupying forces. In this context, German General Ludwig Kubler, commander of the 25th Mountain Army Corps, played a decisive role in implementing particularly brutal counterinsurgency policies. His subsequent capture, extradition to Yugoslavia, and execution in 1947 represent one of the most significant cases of a high-ranking general being tried directly by a previously occupied state. Following the collapse and surrender of the Kingdom of Italy in September 1943, German troops quickly occupied the areas previously controlled by the Italians in Slovenia and northern Croatia. This region was administratively reorganized as the Adriatic Littoral Operations Zone, Operation Zone Adriatic Küstenland, under direct German military control. Ludwig Kubler was appointed operational commander of this strategically crucial territory, assuming command of the mountain and security units deployed in key areas such as Trieste, Gorizia, Ljubljana, and Rijeka. Under his direct authority, German forces implemented systematic anti-partisan mopping-up operations, characterized by exceptional harshness and calculated brutality. Kubler established precise operational guidelines. Any hint of collaboration with partisan units, however small, was to be punished with extreme severity and immediate. Military documents later recovered by Allied intelligence services show that Kubler personally signed orders authorizing summary executions of civilians, deliberate destruction of property, and disproportionate collective reprisals without any judicial process. Military reports from the time document repressive operations in regions such as Gorenjska, where numerous villages were forcibly evacuated, their inhabitants deported to transit or forced labor camps, and their homes systematically burned down on the mere suspicion of sympathy for the resistance. In many documented cases, later reports acknowledged that no tangible evidence of partisan activity was found in these localities, but collective punishment measures were nonetheless applied as a preventative method of territorial control. Between October 1943 and April 1945, units under Kubler's direct command carried out more than 200 operations classified as mopping up in the Alpine region, according to Army Group C's operational records. These actions followed a repetitive pattern. Troops would surround entire villages at dawn, arrest all males of military age, immediately shoot those deemed suspicious according to arbitrary criteria, and transport the rest to detention facilities or labor camps. The files of the War Crimes Commission established by the Yugoslav Provisional Government, later used as evidence in the trial, include detailed testimony about entire villages wiped out in reprisal for previous partisan raids. One particularly well-documented case was the village of Dragosha, where in January 1944 a unit of the 97th Army Corps summarily executed 41 civilians and systematically destroyed the entire village. The original orders, signed in the chain of command overseen by Kubler, specified that these drastic measures were necessary to prevent the spread of the partisan cancer in the region. During these operations, German soldiers frequently used industrial explosives to demolish civilian infrastructure, deliberately destroyed crops, and established restricted access zones that effectively functioned as controlled terror zones. These tactics sought not only to punish suspicious populations, but also to eliminate any logistical base that could potentially support resistance operations, with no regard for the survival needs of the civilian population. At the end of the war, Kubler was captured by American troops on May 8, 1945, near Innsbruck, Austria. He was initially interned in a standard POW camp, but was soon identified as possibly responsible for systematic crimes committed in the Balkans, based on detailed reports issued by the Provisional Government of Yugoslavia and Soviet agents deployed in the Austrian occupation zone. In July 1946, US military authorities formally approved his extradition to Yugoslavia in compliance with the conditions set forth in the 1945 London Agreement and the Moscow Declaration on the Punishment of Nazi Criminals. The transfer took place without trial on German soil or under American jurisdiction and was recorded in the counter-terrorism reports. Intelligence Corps, CIC, as part of the general policy of handing over senior officials considered directly responsible for regional crimes to the countries where the atrocities had been committed. The trial of Ludwig Kubler took place in Ljubljana, the capital of Slovenia, in April 1947. The proceedings were conducted by a Yugoslav military tribunal with specific jurisdiction over war crimes committed in the territory of the former province of Ljubljana during the occupation. The main charge was crimes against humanity, stemming from the systematic extermination campaigns against the Slovenian civilian population between 1943 and 1945. During the court hearings, operational orders signed by Kubler, detailed maps with zones marked for total evacuation, and coordination documents between his command and German special security services, including the SD and the Gestapo, were presented. The prosecution demonstrated that in at least 27 operations directed or authorized by him between November 1943 and September 1944, troops under his command executed more than 3,000 non-combatant civilians, including the elderly, women, and children. Kubler attempted to build his defense by denying having directly ordered the documented massacres, arguing that he was acting on general instructions from the High Command of Army Group C and the OKW, and that his role was purely tactical, not strategic. However, documents recovered from military archives in Trieste and Ljubljana flatly contradicted this version. Some orders, bearing his personal signature, explicitly used terms such as total annihilation and preemptive liquidation of hostile elements, demonstrating his knowledge and approval of the extermination policies. The most shocking aspect of the trial was the direct testimony of survivors from devastated villages. A 63-year-old woman recounted with terrifying precision how her son and 18 other men from her village were collectively shot for refusing to provide information about a partisan group whose location they did not know. Another key witness, a peasant from the Tolmin region, presented documentation with detailed lists of villages systematically evacuated and destroyed under the direct supervision of German officers answering to Kubler's chain of command. The forensic evidence presented by Yugoslav experts included photographs of mass graves, technical analyses of intentionally burned structures, and documented statements from members of the Yugoslav National Liberation Committee who had methodically recorded the atrocities during the occupation. Documented victims included pregnant women, disabled elderly people, and children under 10, refuting any attempt to characterize the operations as legitimate actions against enemy combatants. The tribunal found Kubler guilty on all counts: war crimes, crimes against humanity, and command responsibility for the atrocities committed under his authority. The sentence, handed down on May 13, 1947, imposed the death penalty by firing squad. Following standard practice in post-war Yugoslav military tribunals, there was no right of appeal or possibility of commutation of the death penalty. The execution took place on a military ground outside Ljubljana on August 18, 1947 at 6:30 a.m., and his body was buried in an unmarked mass grave, following standard procedure for war criminals. Kubler's execution concluded one of the last major legal cases brought by Yugoslav courts against high-ranking German officers captured after the war. His case represents a particularly significant example of the Yugoslav approach to post-war justice. Trials focused on specific crimes against local populations, with strong participation of civilian witnesses and extensive documentation of specific atrocities, in contrast to the broader, more systemic trials held at Nuremberg.